Hello everyone, and welcome back to Buried Files. Today, we journey into the forgotten hollers and secluded ridgelines of Appalachia to bring you 8 of the most disturbing encounters ever whispered about beneath the ancient trees. The accounts you will hear were not conjured up for a campfire. Each narrative is drawn from personal reports and lifelong memories of those who still cannot explain what they faced within these shadowed mountains. I have worked to protect the identities of all involved, but the chilling truth in these testimonies remains untouched. If you are new to Buried Files, subscribe now to join us daily for true horror that lingers long after the story ends. Tap the notification bell so you never miss what is unearthed next, because some stories only surface when you are listening. I have been a park ranger for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Black bears wandering into campsites, lost hikers who had strayed miles from marked trails, even the occasional marijuana grow operation hidden deep in the forest. But nothing in my training or experience prepared me for what I discovered during my patrol of the Pisgah National Forest in October of 2019. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I work out of the Asheville district office. That particular morning started like any other. I loaded my truck with supplies, checked my radio, and headed out to inspect the remote sections of Trail 482, a lesser-known path that winds through some of the densest woodland in our jurisdiction. The area sees maybe a dozen visitors per month, mostly serious hikers looking to escape the crowds that flock to the more popular trails near the Blue Ridge Parkway. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and that distinctive mountain freshness that never gets old. I parked at the trailhead around 7 in the morning and began my routine inspection, checking for storm damage, illegal camping, and ensuring the trail markers remain visible and accurate. Everything appeared normal for the first 3 miles. It was when I reached the section known locally as Devil's Hollow that I noticed something was different. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, not even the constant buzz of insects that typically fills these woods. The silence was so profound, it felt like walking through a cathedral, except this quiet carried in weight that pressed against my chest. I stopped walking and listened carefully. In 15 years of working these mountains, I had learned to trust my instincts, and every fiber of my being was telling me that something was fundamentally wrong. The hair on my arms stood up beneath my ranger jacket, and I found myself scanning the tree line with an intensity I had never felt before during a routine patrol. That was when I saw it through the trees, about 50 yards off the main trail. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, filtering through the autumn canopy. But as I moved closer, pushing through the thick undergrowth of mountain laurel and rhododendron, I realized I was looking at something that should not exist in these woods. It was a staircase. Not the wooden steps that we sometimes install for difficult terrain, but an elaborate stone staircase that appeared to be carved from a single massive piece of granite. The steps were perfectly uniform, each one exactly the same height and depth, rising up into the forest at a gentle angle before disappearing into the thick canopy above. I counted 43 visible steps before the staircase vanished into the shadows between the trees. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each step had been polished smooth, and despite being covered with fallen leaves, I could see that the stone showed no signs of weathering or age. There were no tool marks visible, no joints or seams that would indicate the staircase had been assembled from multiple pieces. It looked as though someone had taken a mountain and carved these steps directly from its heart. But that was impossible. I knew every inch of this forest. I had studied topographical maps, aerial photographs, and historical surveys dating back to the early 1900s. There was no record of any structure, no mention of quarrying operations, and certainly no explanation for how such a massive stone staircase could exist in the middle of a federally protected wilderness area. I pulled out my radio to report the discovery, but all I received was static. This was strange because I typically maintained clear communication with base throughout this section of trail. I tried my cell phone and found no signal, which was not unusual given our location. But the timing felt unsettling. As I stood there studying the staircase, I noticed that the silence around me had become even more pronounced. The forest felt frozen, as though time itself had stopped in this small pocket of the mountains. Even the leaves had stopped falling, hanging motionless in the air as if suspended by invisible threads. That was when I felt the pull. It started as a gentle tugging sensation in my chest, like being drawn by a magnet. I found my feet moving toward the base of the staircase without any conscious decision on my part. The feeling was similar to the compulsion you might experience when standing at the edge of a high cliff. Except instead of wanting to jump, I felt an overwhelming urge to climb. I forced myself to stop at the bottom step. The stone was warm beneath my boot, which made no sense given the cool October air. As I stood there, the pulling sensation grew stronger. It was as though something at the top of the staircase was calling to me, promising answers to questions I had never thought to ask. My rational mind kicked in. The training and protocols that had kept me safe for 15 years in these mountains. I stepped back from the staircase and pulled out my digital camera to document what I had found. But when I reviewed the photos on the camera's small screen, they showed only empty forest. No staircase, no carved stone steps, just trees and undergrowth. I looked up from the camera, and the staircase was still there, as solid and real as the ground beneath my feet. I took several more photos, but each one showed the same thing. Normal Appalachian forest with no sign of any stone structure. The pulling sensation was becoming harder to resist. I found myself taking another step toward the staircase, then another. The warm stone felt good beneath my boots, and with each step upward, the compulsion grew stronger. At the fifth step, I could hear something that might have been music, or might have been voices, drifting down from the hidden top of the staircase. The 10th step, I realized I could no longer remember why I had been hesitant to climb. The staircase felt like the most natural thing in the world, as though I had been walking these steps my entire life. The forest around me began to change, the familiar oak and hickory trees giving way to species I could not identify, with bark that seemed to shimmer and leaves that moved in patterns that had nothing to do with wind. It was at the 15th step that I heard my name being called, not by a human voice, but by something that sounded like the forest itself speaking. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the stone beneath my feet and the trees around me. "Marcus," it said, in a voice like wind through caves. "Marcus, come home." That word, home, snapped me back to awareness like a physical blow. This was not my home. My home was a small house outside Asheville, with a mortgage and a dog named Scout and neighbors who borrowed my lawnmower. Whatever was calling to me from the top of these impossible steps was not offering me anything I wanted. I turned and ran down the staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time. Behind me, the voice grew louder and more insistent, no longer sounding like wind, but like something ancient and hungry that had been waiting far too long for company. By the time I reached the bottom, the voice had become a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. I did not stop running until I reached my truck. When I looked back toward the forest, I could see nothing unusual through the trees. just the normal woodland shadows of an October afternoon. My radio crackled back to life, and I could hear my supervisor trying to reach me for a routine check-in. I never reported the staircase officially. Who would have believed me? More importantly, who might have wanted to investigate it? Instead, I quietly researched the history of that particular section of forest, diving deep into archives and old records. What I found kept me awake for months. In 1923, a surveying team had gone missing in Devil's Hollow while mapping the area for the newly established national forest. Their equipment was found scattered along what is now Trail 482, but the 5-man team was never located. The final entry in their field notes, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described stone steps leading up into nothing, and complained that their compasses had stopped working. In 1954, a family of 4 disappeared while camping in the same area. Their campsite was discovered intact, with food still cooking over their fire and personal belongings scattered around as though they had simply walked away mid-meal. The search lasted 3 weeks and covered hundreds of square miles, but no trace of the family was ever found. There were other incidents. A hiker in 1967 who was found wandering naked and incoherent near the trail, claiming he had climbed to the top but could not find his way down. A group of college students in 1985 who reported seeing impossible architecture before 2 of their party vanished during the night. Each incident was investigated, filed, and eventually forgotten by everyone except the families left behind. I have not returned to that section of trail since October 2019. I submitted a report recommending that portion of Trail 482 be temporarily closed for geological instability, a recommendation that was accepted without question. The area remains off-limits to hikers, marked with warnings about unstable terrain and potential rockfall. But sometimes, especially on quiet October nights, when the air carries that particular mountain crispness, I can still feel the pull. It tugs at something deep in my chest, promising answers and calling me home to a place I have never been. And sometimes, when I am patrolling other sections of the forest, I catch glimpses of stone through the trees, smooth, polished surfaces that vanish when I look directly at them. I have started carrying a compass on every patrol now, though I am not sure what I will do if it ever stops working. Because I know the staircase is still there, waiting in Devil's Hollow, waiting for someone curious enough or foolish enough to climb all the way to the top and discover what has been calling from the shadows above the tree line. And I know that someday, despite every rational thought in my head, despite 15 years of training and experience, I am going to answer that call. The pull grows stronger every year, and I am not sure how much longer I can resist the invitation to come home to a place that should not exist, up steps that lead to nowhere anyone has ever returned from. The forest keeps its secrets well, but some secrets do not want to stay buried, and some staircases are meant to be climbed, no matter how much better judgment warns you to walk away. My name is Delilah Mae Sutherland, and I have lived all my life in the small town of Beckley, West Virginia. My grandmother, a woman filled with old Appalachian wisdom, told me stories about the deep hollows tucked away in the mountains before I was even tall enough to reach the kitchen table. Among all her tales, the one I remember most vividly was about Whispering Hollow, a place she warned was forbidden after nightfall. "Never go near there after dark," she would say in a voice filled with both fear and reverence. "For the singing will steal your soul away." Like most children, I dismissed these stories as superstition. My grandmother had dozens of warnings about the mountains. "Do not whistle in the woods. never follow a crying baby, and always carry iron in your pocket. But as I grew older and heard more whispered accounts from hunters, neighbors, and old-timers down at Miller's General Store, the legend of Whispering Hollow took on a life of its own, becoming more than mere myth in my mind. The hollow was a dense, almost impenetrable forest, cloaked in shadows and an unnatural silence that fell with the setting sun. What made Whispering Hollow different from the other mountain tales was the consistency of the stories. Everyone described the same haunting melody, the same irresistible pull, and the same tragic endings for those who ventured too close after dark. My great-uncle Henry had lost his hunting dog there in 1952. The animal was found 3 days later at the edge of the hollow, alive but changed, its eyes vacant and its bark forever silenced. My tale begins the summer I turned 19. I just graduated from high school, restless and filled with a desperate need to prove I was no longer the scared child who trembled when the wind stirred the leaves. That restless energy, combined with the typical arrogance of youth, drove me to convince a small group of friends, classmates from Charleston who were visiting for the weekend, to join me on a hike through Whispering Hollow. They had never heard the local legends, and their skepticism only fueled my determination to show them that the old stories were nothing but mountain superstition. "Come on, Delilah." My friend Marcus laughed when I mentioned the hollow. "You really believe your grandmother's ghost stories? Next, you will be telling us about Bigfoot and UFOs." Their mockery stung more than I cared to admit. I had spent my entire life being dismissed as the backward mountain girl by classmates from more urban parts of the state. This felt like my chance to prove that I was beyond such foolish beliefs, even as a small voice in my head whispered that some beliefs exist for very good reasons. We set out at mid-afternoon on a sweltering June day, the sun filtering dimly through the thick canopy of chestnut and oak trees. The forest floor was a mosaic of dried leaves and moss, muffling our footsteps as we ventured deeper into terrain that grew progressively wilder. The stillness of the place was palpable, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or a whispered rush of the wind through the treetops. With each step forward, the weight of the stories I had heard seemed to settle heavier on my shoulders. What struck me first was how the usual forest sounds gradually faded away. The chatter of squirrels, the calls of birds, even the buzz of insects slowly diminished until we walked in an eerie quiet that felt almost reverent. My friends continued their jokes and laughter, but I noticed their voices growing softer, as though the forest itself demanded respect. As daylight began to fade, transforming the forest into a twilight realm where shadows thickened like smoke, the singing began. At first, it was like the mere rustling of leaves, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. Then the melody emerged, a delicate, sorrowful tune that seemed to weave itself through the very air, filling the hollow with its haunting presence. It was a song filled with longing and loss, simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. "Do you hear that?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling as we all paused on the narrow deer path we had been following. "It sounds like someone is singing." I nodded, my heart pounding wildly. The music was unlike anything I had ever heard in the natural world. It held a strange power, drawing us forward with an irresistible gravity. The legend was not just a story. The hollow was alive with the voices of the lost, just as my grandmother had warned. My friend Marcus, who had been so skeptical earlier, stood frozen with his mouth slightly open. "That is impossible," he murmured. "We are miles from any houses. Who could be singing out here?" We pushed onward, drawn by curiosity and something deeper that I now realize was not entirely our own will. The path led us past the twisted trunks of ancient trees, whose knotted roots tangled across the ground like arthritic fingers. Spanish moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains. And somewhere in the distance, we could hear the gentle trickle of running water. Eventually, the trees opened into a clearing that took my breath away. A circle of giant, moss-covered stones stood like silent sentinels beneath the emerging stars. These were not natural rock formations. They had been placed there deliberately, arranged in a perfect circle that measured perhaps 30 feet across. The stones themselves looked centuries old, their surfaces worn smooth by time and covered with a patchwork of lichens and ivy that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Within the circle stood a figure that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. She was small and slight, appearing to be no more than a child. Yet there was something ancient about her presence. Her skin was pale as moonlight, almost translucent, and her dark hair hung in long, straight curtains that seemed to move with a breeze I could not feel. But it was her eyes that held me captive. They shimmered with an eerie light that seemed to glow from within, reflecting depths that no human eyes should possess. She sang, her voice blending perfectly with the ethereal melody that filled the night air, weaving threads of sorrow and comfort in the same breath. The song had no words that I could understand, yet somehow it spoke directly to my heart, telling stories of loss and loneliness that stretched back through generations. "Stay a while," she sang softly, the words forming clearly now in English. "Safe from the night, safe from the sorrow. Rest here where the singing never ends." That voice, sweet, hypnotic, and impossibly compelling, rooted me to the spot. It was as if the path I had walked along was slipping away beneath my feet, and the only direction left was toward her, deeper into the circle of ancient stones. Everything else, my friends, my life in Beckley, my plans for the future, began to fade like half-remembered dreams. My friends called out, alarm creeping into their voices. "Delilah, come back. Something is wrong here." But I was paralyzed by the song and the pull of the mysterious figure. The hollow seemed to close in around me, thickening the air with its cold embrace while the temperature dropped noticeably. It was then that the secrets of Whispering Hollow began to unravel before my eyes, revealed in the haunting melody that seemed to tell its own story. The figure was not just a lost child, but the spectral daughter of a time long forgotten, a tragic survivor of the mountain families who once lived peacefully in these hills before the coal mines and steel mills swallowed their homes and way of life. As her song continued, images flashed through my mind like fragments of an old film reel. Families gathering in these hills for harvest celebrations, children playing among the stone circle during happier times, and then the coming of industry and progress that scattered the mountain folk like leaves in the wind. According to the vision her song painted, there had been a cruel winter in the late 1800s, when the mountain spirits, angered by the destruction of their sacred places, laid a curse on the last family to leave the hollow. The father had buried his wife and children beneath the snow during that terrible season, and his grief had twisted into something dark and vengeful. His surviving daughter, left alone in the hollow, was bound by his dying curse to wander forever, singing a melody that would soothe the restless spirits while drawing the living deeper into the forest's embrace. The hollow itself had become a trap, cursed to lure in those who dared enter after dark, drawing wanderers closer with its irresistible song until they were lost forever, swallowed by the forest and remembered only in the whispers that floated on the wind during quiet mountain nights. As this terrible understanding washed over me, I watched in horror as my friends began to disappear, one by one, swallowed by them. Shadows at the edge of the clearing. They did not scream or call out. They simply walked forward with peaceful expressions on their faces, drawn by the same compulsion that held me captive. And then they were gone, as though they had never existed at all. The singing girl turned her glowing eyes toward me and smiled, extending one pale hand in invitation. "Come," she whispered, her voice now carrying the echo of centuries. "Join us in the song that never ends. Find peace in the hollow where time stands still." It was my grandmother's voice that saved me, not literally, but the memory of her warnings that suddenly flooded back with startling clarity. "Iron child," I remembered her saying. "Cold iron breaks any mountain curse." Without understanding why, I reached into my pocket and grasped the small iron key to my truck, a simple piece of metal that suddenly felt as powerful as any talisman. The moment my fingers closed around the iron key, the spell shattered like glass. The singing became a shriek of rage. The beautiful clearing revealed itself as a tangle of dead trees and scattered bones. And I ran with a desperation born of pure terror. I fled through the forest as branches clawed at my arms and face, my lungs burning with the effort. Behind me, the singing pursued, no longer beautiful, but filled with fury and hunger. I stumbled over roots, crashed through underbrush, and somehow found my way back to the main trail as the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the trees. I reached my truck as the sun painted the morning sky in pale pinks and golds, my breath coming in ragged gasps, hands bleeding from brambles, and my heart racing with terror that would take years to fully subside. My friends were never found, despite extensive searches by local authorities and volunteers. Their cars were discovered at the trailhead, but no trace of them was ever located in the hollow itself. Despite my escape, the hollow's song has never truly left me. It haunts my dreams and sometimes wakes me in the dead of night. A faint melody riding the wind, like a ghostly reminder that some places never fully release their prisoners. I moved away from Beckley after that summer, unable to live so close to Whispering Hollow. But distance has not provided the peace I sought. For years since, I have kept the secret of what really happened that night, telling only carefully edited versions to those few people I trusted enough to share even part of the truth. The reality of that night is darker than any mountain legend. The singing is not just a haunting echo of the past, but a living curse that waits patiently, ever hungry, ready to welcome anyone foolish enough to enter the hollow after dark. Now, when I hear faint music on quiet summer evenings or catch the slightest melody on an evening breeze, I know the hollow is calling again, waiting for its next visitors. And I know, deep in my bones, that someday it will come for me again. Because some songs are written in blood and sung with voices that will never be silenced. The mountains keep their promises, both good and ill. And Whispering Hollow has been singing the same song for more than a century, waiting patiently for those who refuse to listen to the warnings passed down through generations of mountain wisdom. My name is Jake Rodriguez, and I am from Hazard, Kentucky. I have always felt a strange pull toward the old abandoned coal mines scattered across the Appalachian Mountains. Ghostly remnants of an industry that once fueled much of America. From a young age, I was fascinated not only by their history, but also by the dark, hidden tunnels underneath those hills. The lure was magnetic, almost supernatural. My friends and I formed a group we called the Kentucky Cave Crawlers, and we were obsessed with exploring every forgotten cave, every collapsed shaft, and every hidden crevice we could find from here to Virginia. We thought we knew those woods and underground labyrinths like the back of our hands, until the night we found something that forced us to question everything we believed about what lurks beneath the surface of our mountains. It was the spring of 2015. The entire region was stirring to life after a brutal winter that had kept us cooped up for months. Trees began blossoming new leaves, streams flooded with melting snow, and the mountain air still carried that biting cold after sunset that reminded you winter had not completely loosened its grip. Our group consisted of me, Tom, Eric, Maria, and Sean. 5 reckless 20-somethings who had been tracking down a new exploration site for weeks. We pored over historic mining records at the county courthouse, searched obscure online forums where old-timers shared forgotten stories and hand-drawn maps, and even interviewed a few elderly locals who still remembered the glory days of coal mining in eastern Kentucky. That is how we stumbled upon references to the Black Hollow Pit, a mine that had been officially closed in the mid-1960s, but had since been shrouded in mystery. The records were incomplete, but what we could piece together painted a disturbing picture. The mine had been shut down abruptly after a series of accidents and unexplained disappearances that the mining company had tried to cover up. Workers reported strange sounds echoing from the deeper tunnels, equipment that moved on its own, and an eerie presence that seemed to watch them from the shadows. The final incident involved an entire shift of 12 miners who had gone missing without a trace. Their bodies never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The evening we arrived at Black Hollow, the sun was dipping below the ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like dying embers scattered across the heavens. We parked our trucks at the edge of the hollow and shouldered our backpacks, loaded down with flashlights, ropes, first aid kits, and enough supplies for what we hoped would be a thorough exploration. The entrance to the mine yawned before us like a hungry mouth, framed by the skeletal remains of rusted machinery and weathered wooden structures that had been slowly decomposing for half a century. Warning signs, their paint faded and text barely legible, were scattered around the perimeter like forgotten prayers. The air near the entrance was different, heavier somehow, charged with something indefinable that made the hair on our arms stand up. It smelled of dampness and decay. But underneath those familiar cave scents was something else. Something organic and wrong that none of us could identify. Despite our unease, curiosity won out over caution, and we crossed the threshold into the darkness. Our flashlight beams cut through the thick blackness that seemed to swallow light itself. The tunnel walls pressed close around us, rough-hewn stone and timber supports that groaned ominously under the weight of decades of neglect. With each step, we stirred up clouds of dust and debris that had been undisturbed for years, creating a choking atmosphere that forced us to cover our faces with bandanas. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water falling from unseen heights and the echo of our own footsteps. We spoke in hushed tones, acutely aware of how unstable this place might be, and how a single loud noise could potentially trigger a collapse. As we pushed deeper into the mine, the temperature dropped noticeably, and we found ourselves pulling on extra layers despite having been comfortable outside. Tom, who always carried the specialized equipment for our expeditions, had brought along a heavy-duty grappling hook attached to mountaineering rope, planning to explore any vertical shafts that we might encounter. After what felt like hours of walking through winding passages and navigating around cave-ins, we reached what appeared to be the main shaft, a perfectly circular abyss that plunged straight down into absolute darkness. The engineering was impressive. Whoever had carved this shaft had done so with precision and skill that spoke to the serious mining operation this had once been. Tom secured his rope to a solid anchor point and carefully lowered the grappling hook into the void. hoping to find a ledge or side tunnel somewhere below that we could explore. But no matter how much rope he fed into the shaft, the hook never caught on anything. We began to wonder just how deep this thing went and what secrets might be hidden in its depths. That was when the sounds started. At first, they were so faint we thought we might be imagining them. Soft noises that could have been wind moving through the tunnels or the settling of old timbers. But gradually, they became more distinct and infinitely more disturbing. We began hearing what sounded like breathing, rhythmic and controlled, as though something large was sleeping just beyond the range of our lights. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, the voices echoed up from the depths of the shaft and drifted through the side passages, calling our names with perfect pronunciation and inflection. They spoke in familiar tones, mimicking people we knew, our parents, siblings, childhood friends, and sharing secrets that only we should have known. The voices pleaded for help, promised safety, and begged us to come closer, to help them find their way out of the darkness. Despite every instinct screaming at us to run, curiosity proved stronger than caution. We found ourselves drawn to a narrow side passage that had not been marked on any of the old mining maps we had studied. The walls of this tunnel were different from the others we had explored. They seemed to shimmer in our flashlight beams, covered with a slick, tar-like substance that was oily to the touch and gave off a pungent odor that made our eyes water. The air itself felt thick and oppressive, almost difficult to breathe. And from somewhere deep in the passage came a low, guttural humming that seemed to vibrate through the solid rock. We should have turned back then. Every survival instinct we possessed was screaming warnings. But something compelled us forward, a force that felt almost hypnotic, drawing us deeper into the bowels of the mountain despite our growing terror. That is when we encountered the thing. It emerged from the shadows, like a nightmare given form, a grotesque amalgamation of darkness and stone that defied every natural law we understood. The creature was constantly shifting and changing, its form pulsating like molten rock barely contained by some invisible force. Parts of it seemed solid one moment and vapor the next, as though it existed in multiple states of matter simultaneously. Its eyes were the worst part, blazing red coals that burned with an otherworldly intelligence and malevolence that seemed to pierce straight through to our souls. But what truly unnerved us was its voice. The thing could perfectly mimic any sound it had ever heard, and as we stood frozen in terror, it began calling to us in the voices of our loved ones. It spoke with Tom's mother's worried tone, asking why he had not called home in weeks. It used Maria's voice to beg Sean for help, claiming to be lost and afraid. Most disturbing of all, it began revealing intimate details about our lives, childhood memories, private conversations, secrets we had never shared with anyone. The realization hit us like a physical blow. This thing had been listening, learning, collecting the voices and memories of everyone who had ever entered these tunnels. The missing miners, the disappeared explorers, the workers who had vanished without a trace. They were all here in some sense, trapped within this creature's consciousness and being used as bait for the next victims. Panic erupted among our group. Eric, who had been standing closest to the thing, suddenly screamed and stumbled backward. But something grabbed him from the shadows, invisible hands that dragged him into the darkness despite his desperate struggles. His cries for help echoed through the tunnels for what seemed like an eternity before being cut off with terrifying abruptness. One by one, my friends vanished into the blackness. Tom disappeared while trying to help Eric, yanked into a side passage by unseen forces. Maria's flashlight went out suddenly, and when we tried to find her in the darkness, she was simply gone, as though she had never existed at all. Sean lasted the longest, staying close to me as we tried to find our way back to the main tunnel. But even he eventually succumbed to the thing's call, walking willingly toward the creature despite my desperate pleas for him to stop. I was left alone in the suffocating darkness, surrounded by the thing's whispers and promises. It spoke to me in the voices of everyone I had ever loved, telling me that joining my friends would end my loneliness forever, that I could be part of something greater than myself, that the pain of living would finally stop if I just took a few more steps forward. In that moment of absolute terror and despair, something inside me snapped back to reality. Perhaps it was pure survival instinct, or maybe some deeply buried memory of my grandmother's warnings about the dangers that lurked in the old mines. But I suddenly understood that I had to run, or I would never see daylight again. I turned and fled through the twisting corridors, stumbling over debris and crashing into walls as my flashlight flickered and dimmed. Behind me, the thing's voice followed, no longer sweet and coaxing, but filled with rage and hunger, promising terrible fates if I did not return to join my friends in the eternal darkness. My lungs burned and my legs cramped, but I kept running through passages that seemed to shift and change around me, as though the mine itself was trying to prevent my escape. Just when I thought I would collapse from exhaustion, when my flashlight finally died and left me in complete blackness, I saw a faint glow ahead, the blessed light of dawn creeping through the mine entrance. I burst from the tunnel into the early morning air and collapsed among the rusted machinery and scattered debris, gasping and shaking as the horror of what I had experienced slowly sank in. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting everything in soft pastels that seemed impossibly beautiful after the nightmare I had endured. But even in the safety of daylight, I could still hear faint echoes of the thing's voice calling from the depths, promising that it would be waiting whenever I chose to return. Since that night, my life has never been the same. The nightmares are constant and vivid, filled with visions of my friends being slowly consumed by the creature, their voices added to its collection of lures for future victims. I hear whispers in every shadow, see movement in every dark corner, and live with the constant fear that the thing might somehow follow me into the world above. I have tried to warn others about what lurks in the Black Hollow pit, but most people dismiss my story as trauma-induced delusions or an elaborate hoax. The mine has been officially sealed now, surrounded by new warning fences and signs, but I know that such measures are ultimately meaningless. The thing has been waiting in those tunnels for decades, possibly centuries, and a few barriers will not stop the curious or the foolhardy from finding their way inside. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right through the mountains, I swear I can still hear its voice carried on the air, calling my name, promising reunion with my lost friends, and reminding me that it knows where I live. The Black Hollow pit is no ordinary abandoned mine. It conceals something ancient and predatory, something that feeds on human souls and grows stronger with each victim it claims. And deep in my heart, I know that someday, despite all my efforts to resist, I will return to those tunnels. The thing is patient, and its call grows stronger with each passing year, wearing down my resistance, like water slowly eroding stone. When that day comes, when I finally walk back into the darkness to join my friends, there will be no one left to tell this story or warn the next group of explorers who stumble upon the Black Hollow pit. The mountains keep their secrets, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. My name is Autumn Blackwood, and I am a nature photographer from Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I have spent the last 12 years capturing the wild beauty of the Great Smoky Mountains, documenting everything from the delicate wildflowers that bloom in hidden meadows to the majestic elk that roam the high country. Photography has always been more than just my profession. It is my passion, my escape, and my way of connecting with the ancient spirits that dwell in these mountains. I came to the Smokies in late October of 2018 to photograph the fall colors, armed with nothing but my camera equipment and a lifetime of hiking experience that I thought would keep me safe from anything the wilderness could throw at me. The area I had chosen for this particular shoot was a remote section of the Appalachian Trail that winds through some of the most pristine wilderness left in Tennessee. It was a place few tourists ever ventured, accessible only by a grueling 8-mile hike through dense forest and steep terrain that discouraged all but the most dedicated hikers. I had discovered this location the previous spring while chasing a rare species of wildflower, and the memory of its untouched beauty had drawn me back with the promise of capturing the perfect autumn landscape. I set out before dawn on what promised to be a perfect October day. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, with just enough morning mist to add drama to my photographs. I packed light but carefully. My professional camera gear, extra batteries, enough food and water for a full day in the backcountry, and the usual safety equipment that any experienced hiker carries into the wilderness. The trail was familiar to me, and I expected to reach my destination by mid-morning when the light would be perfect for the shots I had planned. The hike started exactly as I had anticipated. The forest was alive with the colors of autumn, brilliant reds and golds that seemed to glow with an inner fire, punctuated by the deep greens of the evergreens that gave the Smoky Mountains their name. My camera clicked constantly as I documented the journey, capturing the interplay of light and shadow that filtered through the canopy above. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of decomposing leaves and that distinctive mountain freshness that always cleared my mind and lifted my spirits. It was around 10 in the morning when I first noticed the fog. At first, it seemed perfectly natural. A thin mist rising from the valleys below as the morning sun warmed the cool air. The Smokies are famous for their fog, after all, and I had photographed similar phenomena hundreds of times before. But as I continued hiking, I began to realize that this fog was different. Instead of dissipating as the day warmed, it seemed to be growing thicker and more concentrated, forming a solid wall of white that stretched across the valley like a living thing. What struck me as unusual, yes, was how localized the fog appeared to be. While the area directly in front of me was shrouded in an impenetrable mist, the sky above remained perfectly clear, and I could see for miles in every other direction. It was as though someone had drawn a precise boundary around a specific section of the mountains, filling only that area with dense fog while leaving everything else untouched. My photographer's instincts kicked in immediately. This was exactly the kind of unique natural phenomenon that could result in truly spectacular images. The kind that might grace the cover of National Geographic or win awards at prestigious photography competitions. I adjusted my route to get closer to the fog bank, moving off the main trail and into the trackless wilderness that I knew so well. As I approached the edge of the mist, I was struck by how perfectly defined it was. There was no gradual transition from clear air to fog. Instead, there was a sharp demarcation line where the visibility dropped from miles to mere feet in the space of a single step. The temperature differential was immediately noticeable as well. The moment I entered the fog, the air became noticeably colder and more humid, clinging to my skin like a damp blanket. I spent the next hour working the edges of the fog bank, capturing images of the ghostly trees that appeared and disappeared in the swirling mist, the way the fog seemed to move with purpose rather than simply drifting on air currents. My camera captured things my eyes missed. Strange shapes that seemed almost human, moving through the mist with deliberate intent. shadows that did not correspond to any visible objects. It was when I stopped to change lenses that I realized the fog was following me. I had moved perhaps half a mile along the ridge, staying just outside the fog bank to maintain visibility while I worked. But when I looked back at the path I had traveled, I saw that the fog had shifted position, maintaining the same relative distance from me, regardless of which direction I moved. When I walked north, the fog moved north. When I turned south, it adjusted its position accordingly. This was not the behavior of any natural weather phenomenon I had ever encountered. Intrigued rather than alarmed, I still thought I was witnessing some unusual but explainable meteorological event. I decided to test my theory more systematically. I marked my current position with a small cairn of stones and then deliberately walked a quarter-mile in each direction, documenting the fog's response with my camera. The results were undeniable. The fog was actively tracking my movements, maintaining a consistent distance of approximately 50 yards, regardless of terrain or wind conditions. That was when I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. I had been hiking these mountains for over a decade, and I had never encountered anything like this before. Fog simply does not behave this way under normal circumstances. Weather systems are governed by predictable physical laws, temperature differentials, barometric pressure, wind patterns. But this fog seemed to operate according to rules I did not understand, responding to my presence in ways that defied everything I knew about meteorology. As the afternoon wore on, my unease deepened into genuine concern. The fog had not only continued to follow me, but had begun to behave more aggressively. Several times I found myself inadvertently entering the mist when the boundary shifted suddenly, enveloping me in a disorienting whiteout that made navigation impossible. During these brief encounters, I experienced strange sensations. The feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, whispers that might have been wind but sounded disturbingly like human voices, and shadows moving just beyond the edge of visibility. Most disturbing of all was what happened to my sense of time and direction within the fog. On multiple occasions, I would enter the mist for what felt like only a few minutes, only to emerge and discover that hours had passed, and I was miles from where I thought I should be. My GPS became unreliable within the fog, displaying impossible coordinates or simply losing signal altogether. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. It was during one of these disorienting episodes that I encountered the figures. I had been engulfed by the fog for what felt like an eternity, stumbling blindly through the mist while trying to find my way back to familiar terrain. The visibility was down to perhaps 3 feet, and every direction looked identical, an endless maze of ghostly trees and swirling white vapor. My calls for help were absorbed by the fog without even an echo, as though the mist itself was consuming sound. That was when I saw them moving through the fog ahead of me. Human-shaped silhouettes that appeared and disappeared like phantoms. At first, I thought they might be other hikers who had become lost in the same phenomenon I was experiencing, and I called out to them desperately, hoping they might be able to help me navigate out of this supernatural labyrinth. But as I got closer, I realized that these figures were not entirely human. They moved with a strange, gliding motion that seemed to defy gravity, their feet never quite touching the ground. Their proportions were subtly wrong. Arms that were too long, heads that were too large, limbs that bent in directions that human joints should not allow. And their faces, when I caught glimpses of them through the swirling mist, were blank spaces where features should have been. Smooth and featureless, like mannequins that had never been properly finished. The figures seemed aware of my presence, but showed no interest in helping me. Instead, they appeared to be herding me, moving in coordinated patterns that gradually forced me deeper into the fog, away from the safety of clear air and familiar landmarks. When I tried to move in one direction, they would appear to block my path. When I turned to go another way, more figures would materialize to guide me along the route they wanted me to take. Panic finally overcame my fascination with this impossible phenomenon. I realized that I was not simply observing a strange weather event. I was being hunted by something that used the fog as both camouflage and weapon. Something that had possibly been responsible for the unexplained disappearances that occasionally plagued these mountains. Stories I had dismissed as local folklore suddenly took on terrifying new significance. Hikers who had vanished without a trace, search parties that found no evidence despite extensive efforts, the whispered warnings about certain areas of the mountains that should be avoided during times of heavy fog. Drawing on every ounce of my wilderness survival training, I forced myself to stop panicking and think rationally about my situation. The fog might be supernatural, but I was still in physical terrain that followed natural laws. I still had my compass, even if it was spinning wildly, and I still had a general sense of the topography, even if my GPS was failing. Most importantly, I still had my camera, which had been faithfully documenting everything I had experienced. I began taking photographs rapidly, using the camera's flash to illuminate the fog around me in brief, brilliant bursts. The strobing light seemed to disorient the figures that had been herding me, causing them to retreat temporarily into the deeper mist. More importantly, the flash revealed details about my surroundings that were invisible to the naked eye. The actual positions of trees and rocks, the slope of the terrain, and most critically, a faint game trail that led uphill toward what I hoped would be clear air. Using the camera flash as my guide, I fought my way through the fog toward higher ground. The figures followed, their movements becoming more frantic and aggressive as they realized I was escaping their trap. At times, I felt cold hands grasping at my backpack and clothing, trying to pull me back into the depths of the mist. But each time, another burst of light from my camera would force them to retreat, giving me precious moments to continue my desperate ascent. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, time had no meaning within the fog. I finally broke through the upper boundary of the mist and collapsed on solid ground under clear blue skies. The fog lay below me like a vast white ocean, its surface smooth and untroubled, showing no sign of the nightmare I had just endured. The figures were nowhere to be seen, and the oppressive sense of being watched had lifted like a weight removed from my shoulders. I did not stop to rest or recover. Despite my exhaustion and disorientation, I immediately began hiking toward the nearest marked trail, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the supernatural fog bank. It was not until I reached the safety of the main Appalachian Trail, with other hikers visible in both directions, that I finally allowed myself to stop and process what had happened. When I reviewed the photographs from that day, I discovered that my camera had captured far more than I had consciously observed. The images showed the fog-shrouded figures in terrifying detail, their impossible anatomy, their predatory movements, and most disturbing of all, their featureless faces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But most importantly, the photographs provided proof that what I had experienced was not hallucination or altitude sickness, but a genuine encounter with something that defied natural explanation. Since that day, I have never returned to that remote section of the Smokies, despite the fact that it remains one of the most photogenic locations I have ever discovered. The fog appears occasionally in weather reports from that area, described by meteorologists as an unusual localized phenomenon that they cannot fully explain. Hikers still go missing in that region with disturbing regularity. their disappearance is attributed to the challenging terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. But I know the truth about what lurks in that supernatural mist. The fog that follows is not a weather pattern. It is a hunter, patient and intelligent, that uses the natural beauty of the mountains to lure its prey into a trap from which few ever return. And sometimes, on misty October mornings when the conditions are just right, I can still see it from my home in Gatlinburg. A small patch of fog that moves against the wind, searching the ridgelines for its next victim. The mountains keep their secrets, but some secrets are too dangerous to remain hidden. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Smokies and encounter fog that behaves in ways that fog should not behave, do not let curiosity override your survival instincts. Turn around immediately and leave the area as quickly as possible. Some photographs are not worth the price they demand, and some stories are better left untold. Because the fog that follows is still out there, waiting patiently for the next photographer or hiker who thinks they can capture its mysteries without becoming part of them forever. My name is Benjamin O'Sullivan, but everyone has always called me Benny. I am from Charleston, West Virginia, and this is a story I have kept buried for 37 years. A story about 3 months of my childhood that I had convinced myself were nothing more than an overactive imagination until recent events forced me to confront the truth. When I was 8 years old, my family moved to a remote cabin on Pine Ridge, deep in the mountains of West Virginia. For those 3 months during the summer of 1987, I played with children who should never have existed, and the memories of that time have haunted me ever since. My parents, both city people who had grown tired of the hustle and bustle of Charleston, decided that summer to rent a cabin far from civilization. They spoke of wanting to reconnect with nature, to give their children a taste of the simple mountain life they themselves had never experienced. The cabin they found was isolated, even by Appalachian standards. A 2-room log structure built sometime in the early 1900s, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to disappear into the forest itself. Pine Ridge had once been home to a thriving mining community. The mountains were honeycombed with coal shafts and the remnants of company housing. But by the 1980s, nothing remained except foundations overgrown with weeds and rusted machinery, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The nearest neighbors were 15 miles away, and the silence of the mountains was broken only by the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a mountain bird. For the first week, I was miserable. An 8-year-old boy accustomed to sidewalks and playgrounds found little to entertain himself with among the endless trees and rocky outcroppings. My older sister Rebecca spent her time reading books she had brought from home, showing no interest in exploring our temporary wilderness home. My parents were busy with adult concerns, setting up the cabin, establishing routines, and marveling at the natural beauty that surrounded us but meant little to a bored child. It was on the 8th day of our mountain exile that I first encountered them. I had been wandering aimlessly through the woods behind our cabin, following what appeared to be an old trail that might once have connected the scattered mining settlements. The path led me to a clearing where the foundations of several buildings were still visible beneath decades of accumulated leaves and undergrowth. As I stood there trying to imagine what this place might have looked like when it was inhabited, I heard the sound of children laughing. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. We were miles from the nearest house, and I had seen no evidence that any other families were spending their summer in this remote location. But the laughter was unmistakable. The high, clear voices of children at play, filled with the kind of pure joy that only the very young can experience. Following the sound, I pushed through a stand of young pine trees and found myself looking at a group of 5 children playing in what had once been the yard of a large building. They appeared to be roughly my own age, dressed in clothes that seemed oddly old-fashioned, but not unusual enough to strike me as particularly strange at first glance. What did catch my attention was how clean and well-maintained their clothing appeared, despite the fact that they were playing in dirt and undergrowth that should have left them covered in grime. The children noticed me immediately and waved me over with enthusiastic greetings. "Come play with us," called a girl with dark braids tied with bright blue ribbons. We have been waiting for someone new to join our games. Their friendliness was infectious, and within minutes, I had forgotten my loneliness and boredom in the excitement of having found playmates in this isolated mountain retreat. They told me their names: Mary, Thomas, James, Sarah, and little Lucy, and introduced me to games I had never heard of before, but that seemed perfectly natural and entertaining. We played hide and seek among the ruins, built elaborate forts from fallen branches, and told stories that seemed to transport us to other times and places. What struck me as remarkable was how much these children knew about the history of Pine Ridge. They spoke casually about the mines and the families who had once lived here, describing details about daily life that seemed far beyond what children our age should have known or cared about. When I asked them where they lived, they gestured vaguely toward the deeper woods and said they had always been here, that Pine Ridge was their home and always would be. For the next several weeks, I spent every day with my new friends. I would finish breakfast and immediately head into the woods to meet them at our usual gathering place among the ruins. We explored every corner of the abandoned settlement, played games that seemed to come naturally to all of us, and shared stories that blended seamlessly between imagination and memory. My parents were delighted to see me so happy and active after my initial resistance to our mountain adventure. When they asked about my days, I told them about my friends, describing our games and adventures with the enthusiasm that only an 8-year-old can muster. They assumed I was talking about imaginary playmates, a common and healthy part of childhood development, and encouraged my creative storytelling without asking too many detailed questions. It was my sister, Rebecca, who first began to notice that something was not quite right. She had started joining me on some of my excursions into the woods, curious about the elaborate games I described and perhaps feeling left out of my obvious happiness. But whenever she accompanied me to the clearing where I met my friends, she found only empty ruins and the normal sounds of the forest. When I pointed excitedly to where Mary and Thomas were playing, she saw nothing but shadows and undergrowth. At first, she teased me gently about my vivid imagination. But as the days passed, her concern grew. She began to notice that I would respond to voices she could not hear, react to events she could not see, and carry on detailed conversations with empty air. More disturbing still, she began to research the history of Pine Ridge and discovered facts that I should not have known, but that I casually mentioned in my stories about my friends. The breakthrough came when she found an old newspaper article in the Charleston Library archives. In the spring of 1952, there had been a tragic accident at the Pine Ridge mining operation. A tunnel collapse had trapped dozens of workers underground, and despite heroic rescue efforts, many lives were lost. Among the victims were 5 children who had been playing near the mine entrance when the disaster occurred. Mary, Thomas, James, Sarah, and Lucy, all between the ages of 7 and 9. When Rebecca showed me the newspaper photographs of the 5 children who had died in 1952, I recognized my playmates immediately. The faces that stared back at me from the yellowed newspaper clippings were the same faces I saw every day among the ruins of Pine Ridge. The clothes they wore in their school photographs were identical to the clothing I had seen them wearing during our games. The revelation should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of completion, as though a puzzle I had been unconsciously working on had finally been solved. These children had been waiting for 35 years for someone to play with them again. Someone who could see them and hear them and help them remember what it felt like to be alive and happy and carefree. For the remaining weeks of our stay at Pine Ridge, I continued to spend time with my phantom friends. But now, our games took on a different quality. They began to tell me stories about their lives before the accident, about their families and their dreams and their fears. They spoke about the day the mountain fell down and how they had been playing their favorite game of hide and seek when everything went dark and quiet. Most heartbreaking of all, they told me about the loneliness of the years that followed. Decades of wandering through the abandoned ruins of their former home, calling out to visitors who could not hear them, playing games that no one else could see. They had been waiting, they explained, for someone like me to come along. Someone young enough and open enough to bridge the gap between their world and ours. As the end of August approached, my family prepared to return to Charleston. The children of Pine Ridge became increasingly anxious about my departure. They begged me to stay, to convince my parents to make the cabin our permanent home, to promise that I would return the following summer. The desperation in their voices broke my heart. But I was only 8 years old and had no power to make such promises or decisions. On our last day at the cabin, I met my friends one final time in the clearing among the ruins. They seemed dimmer somehow, less substantial, as though my impending departure was already beginning to sever the connection between us. We played our favorite games one last time, told our favorite stories, and made promises that we all knew might be impossible to keep. When the time came to say goodbye, little Lucy clung to my hand with fingers that felt as cold as mountain stream water. "Do not forget us, Benny," she whispered. "Promise you will not forget us and let us disappear forever." I promised, of course, as any child would promise his friends. But as the years passed and adult concerns took precedence over childhood memories, I found myself thinking less and less about those 3 magical months on Pine Ridge. The memories began to seem like elaborate fantasies, the product of a lonely child's overactive imagination during a boring summer in the mountains. It was not until this past October, 37 years later, that I learned the truth about what had happened to me that summer. I had returned to West Virginia for my father's funeral, and while going through his papers, I found a box of old photographs and documents from our time at the cabin. Among them was a journal my mother had kept during those 3 months, documenting our family's adventure in the mountains. Reading her entries, I discovered details about my behavior that she had never mentioned to me as a child. According to her journal, there were days when I would disappear for hours at a time, only to be found sitting alone in the clearing, apparently carrying on animated conversations with invisible companions. She wrote about hearing me laughing and playing even when I was nowhere to be seen, and about finding me building elaborate structures from sticks and stones that seemed far too complex for a child my age to construct alone. Most disturbing of all, she had documented several occasions when I had returned from my adventures with knowledge I could not possibly have possessed. Detailed information about the mining operations, accurate descriptions of buildings that had been demolished decades before our arrival, and stories about families who had lived on Pine Ridge in the early 1900s. But the final entry in her journal was what convinced me that my childhood memories were more than imagination. On the day before we left the cabin, my mother had found me in the clearing one last time, sitting alone but clearly interacting with unseen presences. As she watched from the edge of the forest, she saw something that challenged everything she believed about the natural world. For just a moment, in the shifting patterns of light and shadow among the ruins, she caught a glimpse of 5 children playing with their invisible friend. Children who flickered in and out of visibility like figures seen through heat waves, their laughter echoing faintly through the mountain air before fading into silence. Now, as an adult with children of my own, I understand what happened during those 3 months on Pine Ridge. The children who died in 1952 had indeed been waiting for someone to find them, someone who could see past the barriers that separate the living from the dead. For a brief time that summer, I had served as their bridge back to the world of the living, giving them a chance to play and laugh and feel alive again. I have never returned to Pine Ridge, despite the promises I made as a child. Life has a way of pulling us away from the mysteries and magic of our youth, filling our days with responsibilities and practical concerns that leave little room for phantom playmates and ghostly games. But sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, when the air is still and the shadows are long, I can still hear the faint sound of children laughing somewhere far away in the mountains. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if they are still waiting for me to come back and play with them one more time among the ruins of Pine Ridge, where 5 little ghosts learned what it meant to be children again, if only for a few precious months in the summer of 1987. My name is Isabella Kowalski, though my friends have always called me Izzy. I am from Morgantown, West Virginia, and I work as a cultural anthropologist specializing in Appalachian folklore. When I was researching my doctoral thesis on indigenous supernatural beliefs in the mountain regions, I discovered that some legends are not just stories passed down through generations, but living realities that continue to interact with our world in ways that defy academic understanding. What began as scholarly research became a personal encounter with something ancient and intelligent that watches over the mountains with purposes we can barely comprehend. The focus of my dissertation was the intersection between Cherokee mythology and European settler folklore in the creation of modern Appalachian supernatural beliefs. I had spent 2 years collecting oral histories from elderly residents throughout West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, documenting the ways that different cultural traditions had blended together over centuries to create unique regional legends. My research had taken me to remote mountain communities where stories were still told around kitchen tables and front porch gatherings, places where the line between history and mythology remained deliberately blurred. It was during this fieldwork that I first heard whispers about Devil's Backbone, a narrow ridge deep in the Monongahela National Forest that locals claimed was protected by something they called the Watcher. The stories were fragmentary and contradictory. Some described it as a guardian spirit left behind by the Cherokee to protect sacred burial grounds, while others claimed it was something older and more alien that had lived in the mountains since before humans arrived. What remained consistent across all versions was the warning that certain areas of Devil's Backbone should never be approached by outsiders, especially those who came seeking to study or document what they found there. As an academic trained in critical thinking and scientific methodology, I initially dismissed these warnings as typical folklore designed to keep strangers away from culturally sensitive sites. But the more interviews I conducted, the more I began to notice patterns that suggested something more substantial than mere superstition. Multiple witnesses, separated by decades and having no contact with each other, described identical encounters with something that watched them from the shadows of the forest, something that seemed to understand human behavior and motivations better than humans understood themselves. My decision to visit Devil's Backbone in person was driven by scholarly curiosity rather than belief in the supernatural. I wanted to document the site that had generated so many consistent stories. to photograph the terrain and gather environmental details that might explain why this particular location had become the focal point for regional mythology. I planned a 3-day solo expedition for late September 2019, when the autumn colors would provide excellent photographic opportunities and the cooler weather would make hiking more comfortable. The trailhead that led to Devil's Backbone was unmarked and difficult to find, accessible only through a maze of old logging roads that had been abandoned decades earlier. I parked my vehicle at what appeared to be a former timber camp and began hiking through dense forest that showed little evidence of human visitation. The trees were ancient and massive, creating a canopy so thick that even midday sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. The silence was profound and unsettling. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. After several hours of difficult hiking through increasingly rugged terrain, I reached the base of Devil's Backbone itself. The ridge rose above me like a natural fortress, its narrow spine crowned with jagged outcroppings of limestone that had been carved into fantastic shapes by centuries of wind and rain. What struck me immediately was how the vegetation changed as I climbed higher. The familiar oak and maple trees of the lower elevations gave way to species I could not readily identify. Plants that seemed somehow older and more primitive than anything I had encountered during my years of mountain research. It was as I approached the crest of the ridge that I first felt the sensation of being watched. The feeling was subtle at first, just a slight uneasiness that made me pause occasionally to look over my shoulder. But as I continued climbing, the sensation grew stronger and more specific, not the general alertness that comes from being alone in wild country, but the distinct awareness that something intelligent was observing my every movement. I found myself stopping frequently to scan the forest around me, searching for any sign of what might be causing this persistent feeling of scrutiny. The summit of Devil's Backbone was a narrow plateau, perhaps 50 feet wide and several hundred feet long, covered with a mixture of exposed stone and hardy mountain vegetation. What immediately caught my attention were the stone formations scattered across the ridge. Not natural rock outcroppings, but carefully arranged structures that clearly showed evidence of human construction. These were not the crude rock piles that hikers sometimes build as trail markers, but sophisticated arrangements that demonstrated both engineering skill and artistic sensibility. As I began photographing these structures and taking detailed notes for my research, I became increasingly aware that my presence was not welcome here. The feeling of being watched had intensified to an almost physical sensation, as though invisible eyes were boring into me from multiple directions simultaneously. More disturbing still, I began to sense a form of communication taking place. Not words or sounds, but direct transmission of thoughts and emotions that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond my normal perception. The message, if it could be called that, was clear and unmistakable. I was trespassing in a place that was not meant for human visitation, studying things that were not meant to be documented or understood by outsiders. The presence that watched me was not hostile exactly, but it was profoundly alien in ways that made my human consciousness recoil from direct contact. This was something that had existed in these mountains for far longer than human civilization, something that regarded our entire species with a mixture of curiosity and benevolent condescension. As the afternoon wore on, my discomfort grew to the point where I found it difficult to concentrate on my research. Every photograph I took felt like a violation of some unspoken agreement. Every note I wrote seemed to deepen my transgression against forces I did not understand. The presence that watched me was becoming more assertive in its communication, filling my mind with images and sensations that were both beautiful and terrifying. I saw visions of the ridge as it had existed thousands of years ago, when the Cherokee people had recognized it as a sacred site and approached it with appropriate rituals and offerings. I experienced the arrival of European settlers who had unknowingly violated the sanctity of the place, bringing with them technologies and attitudes that the Watcher found incomprehensible. Most disturbing of all, I witnessed scenes of other researchers and curious visitors who had come to Devil's Backbone over the years. Some had been allowed to leave unharmed after receiving suitable warnings, while others who had shown disrespect or attempted to exploit what they found had simply disappeared, their fates left deliberately ambiguous. The realization that I was being evaluated according to criteria I could not fully understand filled me with a terror unlike anything I had experienced during my academic career. This was not the rational fear that comes from physical danger, but a deeper existential dread that stemmed from confronting intelligence so alien that human comprehension could barely grasp its nature. I was a specimen under examination by something that regarded human consciousness as we might regard the mental processes of insects. Interesting, perhaps, but ultimately limited and predictable. As evening approached and shadows began to gather on the ridge, the Watcher's presence became almost overwhelming. I could feel it moving around me, invisible but undeniably real, studying my reactions with scientific detachment. The stone structures I had been photographing seemed to pulse with subtle energy, and the air itself felt thick with forces that existed outside the normal physical laws I had been taught to trust. It was then that I understood the true purpose of my encounter with the Watcher. I had come to Devil's Backbone believing that I was conducting research on local folklore, but in reality, I was being researched. The entity that guarded this ridge had been observing human behavior for centuries, collecting data about our species with the same methodical approach that I had been using to study Appalachian legends. Every visitor to the ridge became part of an ongoing experiment, their responses carefully cataloged and analyzed by an intelligence that was trying to understand the strange creatures that had recently appeared in its ancient domain. The anthropologist in me found this reversal of roles both fascinating and humbling. I had spent years studying the beliefs and behaviors of mountain communities, approaching them as subjects to be understood and documented. Now I found myself in the position of being the subject, examined by an intelligence far superior to my own. My every thought and reaction, noted for purposes I could not begin to fathom. As darkness fell completely over Devil's Backbone, the Watcher finally made direct contact with my consciousness. The communication was not verbal. It came as a flood of pure information that bypassed language entirely. I learned that the entity had been appointed as guardian of this ridge by forces even more ancient and powerful than itself, tasked with protecting certain knowledge that humanity was not yet ready to possess. The Cherokee had understood this arrangement and had approached the site with appropriate reverence. But the arrival of European settlers had disrupted the ancient agreements and created situations that the Watcher was still learning how to handle. Most importantly, I understood that I was being given a choice. I could continue my research into Appalachian folklore, but I would need to omit certain details about Devil's Backbone from my academic work. The existence of the Watcher and the true nature of the ridge would remain protected secrets, shared only with those who demonstrated sufficient wisdom and respect to handle such knowledge responsibly. In exchange for this discretion, I would be granted insights into the deeper mysteries of the mountains that no other researcher had ever been allowed to discover. The decision was both easy and terrible. My academic training demanded complete honesty and full disclosure of my findings. But my encounter with the Watcher had shown me that some knowledge carries responsibilities that transcend scholarly obligation. I agreed to the terms, understanding that I was crossing a line from which there would be no return. When I descended from Devil's Backbone the following morning, I carried with me information that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, reality, and humanity's place in a universe far stranger than we have ever imagined. But I also carried the weight of keeping certain secrets, of protecting knowledge that could be dangerous if revealed too early or to the wrong people. My dissertation was completed and accepted without any mention of my true discoveries on Devil's Backbone. Officially, I had found nothing more than interesting examples of how indigenous beliefs had been incorporated into settler folklore. But privately, I continued to correspond with the Watcher through methods that cannot be explained in conventional terms, serving as a liaison between its ancient intelligence and the human communities that live in the shadow of the mountains. The arrangement has continued for 5 years now, and I have learned things about the nature of reality that no university course could ever teach. The Watcher is not unique. There are similar entities scattered throughout the Appalachian range, guardians left behind by predecessor civilizations to monitor and guide the development of younger species like humanity. They have been observing our progress for millennia, taking notes on our evolution and occasionally intervening when our activities threaten to disrupt forces beyond our comprehension. Sometimes, late at night in my office at the university, I receive communications from Devil's Backbone that remind me of my ongoing responsibilities. The Watcher continues to study human behavior through my reports and observations, trying to understand whether our species is ready for the next stage of contact with intelligences that have been patiently waiting for us to mature enough to handle such encounters. The mountains keep their secrets, but some of us have been chosen to serve as bridges between the ancient wisdom that dwells in the high places and the curious, chaotic energy of human civilization. It is a responsibility I never sought, but one that I have learned to embrace, knowing that someday, when humanity is finally ready, the Watchers will reveal themselves and share knowledge that will transform our understanding of everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. Until then, I continue my academic work and my secret correspondence, serving as both researcher and subject in an experiment that began long before our species existed and will continue long after we have evolved into something the Watchers consider worthy of true partnership. The choice to participate was mine, but the consequences belong to all of humanity. A species still being evaluated by entities whose judgment will determine our ultimate fate among the stars. My name is Caleb Washington, and I am from Boone, North Carolina. Every summer for 15 years, my extended family would gather at Mirror Lake, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, for our annual reunion. It was a tradition that went back 3 generations, started by my grandfather, who had built a cluster of cabins around the pristine mountain lake in the 1960s. Those summer weeks at Mirror Lake were the highlight of every year for our family. A time when cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents would come together from across the country to reconnect, share stories, and create the kind of memories that bind families together across time and distance. Until the summer of 2017, when something emerged from the depths of that ancient lake, and our family gathering turned into a nightmare that still haunts those of us who survived. Mirror Lake sits in a bowl-shaped valley surrounded by towering peaks that rise like cathedral walls toward the sky. The water is impossibly clear and deep, fed by underground springs that keep it cold even in the height of summer. Local Cherokee legends spoke of the lake as a gateway between worlds, a place where the spirits of the dead could return to visit the living during certain times of the year. My grandfather had always dismissed such stories as folklore, though he admitted that the lake had an otherworldly quality that made even skeptics feel they were in the presence of something ancient and powerful. The reunion that year brought together 23 family members, ranging from my 84-year-old grandmother down to my cousin's twin daughters, who had just turned 6. We occupied all 5 cabins that ringed the lake, with the main lodge serving as our gathering place for meals and evening activities. The first few days proceeded exactly as they had for years, swimming and fishing during the day, campfires and storytelling at night, and the comfortable rhythm of family life that made Mirror Lake feel like the most peaceful place on earth. It was on the 4th night that we first noticed something was wrong with the lake itself. My Uncle Robert, who had been coming to Mirror Lake since childhood, pointed out that the water level seemed unusually low for that time of year. What was more disturbing was the color. Instead of the crystal clear blue we had always known, the lake had taken on a murky green tint that made it impossible to see more than a few feet below the surface. When my cousin David went out in the canoe the next morning to investigate, he reported that the water felt different somehow, thicker and warmer than it should have been. That afternoon, my nephew Timothy, who was 12 years old and an excellent swimmer, went missing while playing near the shoreline. We searched for hours, diving repeatedly into the murky water and scouring every inch of the lake's perimeter. Timothy was not the kind of child to wander off without telling anyone. And he had been swimming in Mirror Lake since he was old enough to walk. The family began to panic as evening approached with no sign of the boy, and we were preparing to call for outside help when Timothy suddenly walked out of the forest, soaking wet and clearly disoriented. When we asked him where he had been, Timothy told a story that none of us wanted to believe. He claimed that something had grabbed him while he was swimming and pulled him down to the bottom of the lake, where he had found an underwater cave filled with air. Inside the cave, he said, he had met his grandfather. Not my grandfather, who was still alive, but his other grandfather, who had died 3 years earlier. The dead grandfather had told Timothy that the lake was changing, that something old and powerful was awakening in its depths, and that our family needed to leave immediately, or we would all be in terrible danger. We attributed Timothy's story to trauma and confusion, possibly a near-drowning experience that had left him temporarily disoriented. But that night, other family members began to report strange encounters. My Aunt Sarah claimed she had seen her deceased mother standing on the dock, beckoning her to come into the water. My cousin Jennifer swore that her dead brother had appeared in her cabin, warning her to pack up and leave before it was too late. The next morning brought even more disturbing developments. Several family members reported that they had been visited during the night by relatives who had passed away years or even decades earlier. These encounters were not dreams or hallucinations. They were vivid, detailed conversations with people who knew intimate details about family history and current events that no imagination could have conjured. All of the deceased visitors delivered the same message. Something ancient had awakened in Mirror Lake, something that could take the form of anyone it had ever claimed, and our family was in mortal danger if we remained. Despite these warnings, most of the family was reluctant to cut short our reunion and abandon a tradition that had meant so much to us for so many years. My grandfather, ever the pragmatist, suggested that we were all experiencing some form of group hysteria, possibly brought on by stress or environmental factors like changes in air pressure or water chemistry. He refused to consider leaving early, and his authority as the family patriarch convinced most of the others to stay. That decision proved to be a fatal mistake. On the 6th night of our reunion, the thing in the lake finally revealed its true nature. I was awakened around 3 in the morning by the sound of voices outside my cabin. Familiar voices belonging to family members who should have been asleep in their own beds. Looking out my window, I saw figures moving around the shoreline. But there was something wrong with the way they moved. something unnatural about their posture and gait that made my skin crawl with instinctive fear. As I watched in, growing horror, I realized that these figures were not my living family members, but perfect duplicates created by whatever entity dwelt in the depths of Mirror Lake. They looked exactly like my relatives, spoke in their voices, and even wore their clothing. But they moved with a predatory grace that belonged to something that had never been human. These doppelgangers were moving from cabin to cabin, calling out to the sleeping occupants in voices filled with love and concern, trying to lure them outside where they could be replaced. I grabbed the emergency flare gun my grandfather kept in every cabin and fired it into the sky, hoping to wake everyone and alert them to the danger. The red flare burst overhead like a miniature sun, bathing the entire lake in crimson light that revealed the true horror of our situation. The shoreline was crowded with dozens of figures, duplicates of every family member who had ever visited Mirror Lake, including relatives who'd been dead for decades. They stood motionless in the water up to their waists, their eyes reflecting the flare's light like the eyes of nocturnal predators. The real family members began emerging from their cabins, confused and frightened by the commotion. What followed was a scene of absolute chaos as we tried to distinguish between the living and the replicas that had been created to replace us. The duplicates were perfect in every detail, except for their eyes, which held an alien intelligence that had nothing to do with human consciousness. They spoke our names, pleaded with us using our own voices, and even shared memories that only the real family members should have known. My grandmother, the matriarch of our family and the wisest among us, was the first to understand what we were facing. She had grown up hearing Cherokee stories about Mirror Lake and the spirits that dwelt beneath its surface. According to the old legends, the lake was home to an entity that fed on human experiences and emotions, sustaining itself by absorbing the essence of those who drowned in its depths. Over the decades, it had been creating perfect replicas of its victims, learning to mimic human behavior with increasing sophistication. The entity had been waiting patiently for our family reunion, when it could claim multiple victims at once and add their memories and personalities to its ever-growing collection. The deceased relatives who had appeared to warn us were not ghosts or hallucinations, but earlier victims trying to save us from sharing their fate. What followed was a nightmare of confusion and terror as we tried to escape from the lake while avoiding the duplicates that were trying to prevent our departure. The real horror was not knowing which family members were genuine and which were replicas designed to lead us into traps. Several times I found myself talking to what I thought was a cousin or uncle, only to realize from some subtle wrongness in their behavior that I was facing an imposter that wanted to drag me down into the lake's murky depths. In the end, only 11 of the 23 family members who had come to Mirror Lake that summer managed to escape. The others were claimed by the entity. Their bodies never recovered despite extensive search efforts by local authorities. Officially, they were listed as drowning victims, casualties of a tragic accident that had somehow claimed 12 people in a single night. The surviving family members gave conflicting accounts of what had happened, leading investigators to conclude that we were suffering from trauma-induced memory problems. The cabins around Mirror Lake were abandoned after that summer, left to decay in the mountain wilderness. My grandfather, broken by the loss of so many family members, never spoke of what had happened there. He died 2 years later, taking his silence to the grave, along with whatever guilt he felt for not heeding the warnings that might have saved the others. Those of us who survived have never gathered for another family reunion. The bonds that once held us together were severed that night at Mirror Lake, replaced by shared trauma and the terrible knowledge that some of the people we thought we had escaped with might not have been the real family members at all. We live with the constant fear that the entity followed us home, that the loved ones we thought we had saved might be perfect replicas designed to infiltrate our lives and eventually lead us back to the lake that hungers for human souls. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I receive phone calls from family members who died at Mirror Lake. They beg me to return, promising that the entity has learned to control its hunger, that it only wants to reunite our family in the peaceful depths where no one ever grows old or experiences pain. Their voices are exactly as I remember them, filled with love and longing that almost makes me believe their promises. But I know the truth about Mirror Lake and the thing that dwells in its depths. The Cherokee were right to consider it a gateway between worlds, though they never imagined how literal that description would prove to be. Some bodies of water are not meant for human recreation, no matter how beautiful they appear on the surface. The entity that claimed my family continues to wait patiently in those dark depths, perfecting its collection of human replicas and preparing for the next group of unsuspecting visitors who will mistake its hunger for hospitality. Mirror Lake still appears on topographical maps and hiking guides, described as a pristine mountain destination perfect for family camping. But those of us who know its true nature have tried to spread warnings through unofficial channels, hoping to prevent other families from suffering the fate that befell our summer reunion. The mountains keep many secrets, but some secrets are too dangerous to remain hidden, especially when they involve entities that view human beings as nothing more than raw material for their endless, patient hunger. The lake remembers everyone who has ever entered its waters, and someday it will call them all home to join the perfect family that exists forever in the depths where time has no meaning and love never dies. My name is Dakota Rivers, and I am from Pikeville, Kentucky. I have been driving the mountain roads of Appalachia for 20 years, hauling freight through every holler and gap from Virginia to Tennessee. These highways hold no secrets from me, or so I thought, until that October night in 2016 when I discovered a stretch of road that exists outside of time itself. There is one section of Route 119 that I will never travel again. A cursed piece of asphalt where the past bleeds through into the present and travelers can become trapped forever in a loop that began more than 70 years ago. The run that changed everything was supposed to be routine. I was hauling a load of lumber from a mill outside Hazard to a construction site in Bluefield, a route I had driven hundreds of times before. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was making good time on familiar roads. It was just past midnight when I reached the section of highway that winds through the most remote part of Pike County, where the mountains rise like black walls on either side, and civilization feels like a distant memory. Mile marker 13 has always been a landmark I use to gauge my progress on this route. The marker sits at the bottom of a long valley where the road follows an old creek bed surrounded by forest so dense that even moonlight barely penetrates the canopy. But that night, as my headlights swept across the familiar white sign, I noticed something that had never been there before. A faint glow coming from somewhere deeper in the valley, like the light from a distant radio tower. Curious, I slowed my rig and rolled down the window to get a better look. That was when I heard it. The sound of music drifting through the night air, big band jazz from the 1940s mixed with static like it was coming from an old AM radio. The signal was crystal clear despite the remote location, clearer than any station I had ever picked up in these mountains. I reached for my radio to see if I could tune it in, but all I found was dead air across the entire spectrum. The music seemed to be coming from the forest itself, emanating from somewhere beyond the tree line where no radio tower should exist. Against my better judgment, I pulled my truck onto the narrow shoulder and climbed down from the cab to investigate. The October air was crisp and still, and the sound of the music became clearer as I walked toward the edge of the forest. Mixed in with the jazz were voices, a radio announcer speaking in the clipped, formal tones of the 1950s, advertising products that had not been manufactured in decades. Following the sound, I pushed through the undergrowth until I found an old logging road that was not marked on any map I had ever seen. The road was in remarkably good condition despite its apparent age, with fresh gravel and recently maintained drainage ditches. Most unsettling of all, there were tire tracks in the dirt, not the deep treads of modern vehicles, but the narrow prints left by cars from another era. The music grew louder as I followed the logging road deeper into the valley, and soon I could make out the glow of electric lights filtering through the trees ahead. What I found when I reached the source of the light defied every rational explanation I could conjure. Hidden in a clearing that should not have existed was a radio station that appeared to have been operating continuously since the early 1950s. The building was a small concrete block structure with large windows and a tall transmission tower rising from the roof. Through the windows, I could see a disc jockey at work, spinning records on equipment that looked like museum pieces. He wore a white shirt, thin tie, and suspenders, the uniform of radio men from a bygone era. The call letters painted on the building read WSKY, and a sign beneath them proclaimed, "Your voice in the sky, broadcasting since 1952. I should have turned around and left immediately, but curiosity overwhelmed caution. I approached the building and knocked on the door, which was answered by the disc jockey himself. A man in his 30s with slicked back hair and horn-rimmed glasses who looked exactly like every stereotype of a 1950s radio personality. He greeted me with enthusiastic friendliness, as though late-night visitors were perfectly normal at his remote mountain station. "Welcome to WSKY, he said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "I am Johnny Sterling, your midnight host. Come on in and see how we make the magic happen." The interior of the station was a perfect time capsule from the Eisenhower era. The equipment was all vacuum tubes and analog meters. The furniture was chrome and formica, and the walls were covered with promotional materials for products and entertainers that had been popular 70 years earlier. Johnny offered me coffee from a percolator and continued his radio show, chatting with me between songs as though I were a regular guest. During a commercial break for a car dealership that had gone out of business decades ago, Johnny explained that WSKY served the mountain communities throughout eastern Kentucky, bringing music and news to isolated families who depended on radio for connection to the outside world. He spoke about the station with genuine pride and passion, describing his listeners as friends and neighbors who had been loyal to WSKY for generations. What disturbed me most was how natural everything felt inside the station. Despite the obvious impossibility of the situation, I found myself relaxing in Johnny's company, enjoying the music and the warm atmosphere of the studio. Time seemed to move differently within those walls. What felt like minutes might have been hours, and the night outside remained perpetually frozen at the same pre-dawn darkness. It was only when Johnny began taking listener requests that I realized the true horror of my situation. The phone calls came from people with names and voices that sounded increasingly familiar. Listeners who claimed to live in communities that had been abandoned or destroyed decades earlier. They requested songs for departed relatives, shared news about events that had happened before I was born, and spoke about the present as though it were still 1952. As the night wore on, I began to notice other disturbing details. The commercial sponsors Johnny mentioned were businesses that had closed in the 1950s. The news reports he read concerned events from the Truman administration, and the weather forecasts predicted conditions for dates that had already passed 70 years earlier. Most unsettling of all, the requests began including messages for me. Listeners calling in to welcome the new truck driver and suggesting songs they thought I might enjoy. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was not visiting a radio station from the past, but a temporal trap that existed outside normal time. The station and everyone associated with it were caught in an endless loop, broadcasting the same shows, playing the same music, and living the same night over and over again. And now, by entering the station and interacting with Johnny, I risked becoming part of that loop myself. Fighting down panic, I told Johnny that I needed to get back to my truck and continue my delivery run. He seemed genuinely disappointed by my departure, but walked me to the door with the same cheerful hospitality he had shown all evening. As I stepped outside, he called after me with a friendly wave. "Come back anytime, friend. WSKY is always here for you, 24 hours a day. We will be right here waiting when you need us." I ran through the forest back to my truck, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over roots in my desperate haste to escape. Behind me, the music continued to play, and I could hear Johnny's voice carrying through the night air as he introduced the next song for his invisible audience of listeners trapped in time. When I reached my truck, I threw it into gear and drove away as fast as the mountain roads would allow. But as I passed mile marker 13 again, traveling in the opposite direction, I was horrified to hear WSKY's signal coming through my truck's radio, clear and strong despite the increasing distance. Johnny was playing the same songs I had heard in the studio, taking the same requests from the same ghostly listeners, trapped in his eternal broadcast loop. Over the following weeks, I tried to research WSKY and learn the truth about what I had encountered. What I discovered was more disturbing than I had imagined. There had indeed been a radio station with those call letters operating in Pike County during the early 1950s. WSKY had been a small local station that served the mountain communities, owned and operated by a young disc jockey named Johnny Sterling, who was passionate about bringing music and news to isolated listeners. On October 13th, 1952, Johnny and his entire night shift crew had vanished without a trace. Their car was found abandoned near mile marker 13, but no sign of the men was ever discovered despite extensive search efforts. The radio station was closed permanently, its equipment sold off, and the building eventually demolished. But according to local legend, WSKY had never really gone off the air. Drivers on the lonely mountain highway sometimes reported hearing faint music and a disc jockey's voice late at night, broadcasting from a station that no longer existed. Since my encounter with Johnny Sterling and his impossible radio station, I have changed my route to avoid that section of Route 119. But sometimes, when I am driving other mountain roads late at night, I pick up fragments of WSKY's signal on my radio. A few bars of 1950s jazz, a snippet of Johnny's cheerful patter, or the voice of a listener calling in with a request for a song that stopped being popular before I was born. The most disturbing part is that some of those requests are now for me. Anonymous callers who somehow know my name and my route, suggesting songs they think the friendly truck driver might enjoy, inviting me to visit the station again whenever I am passing through Pike County. They promise that Johnny is still waiting for me, still broadcasting his eternal show to an audience of listeners who exist outside of time. I know that someday, despite all my efforts to stay away, I will find myself driving past mile marker 13 again. When that night comes, when loneliness and curiosity overcome caution, I will follow that old logging road back to the radio station where time stands still. and Johnny Sterling spins his records for an audience that will never grow old. The mountain roads hold many secrets, but some secrets are traps disguised as mysteries, and some invitations are meant to be declined no matter how friendly the host may seem. Until then, I drive different routes and avoid the highways that wind through the deepest hollows, where the past refuses to stay buried and radio stations broadcast forever from valleys that exist outside the normal flow of time. But on quiet nights, when the static clears and the signals travel far, I sometimes hear Johnny's voice welcoming me back to WSKY, promising that the music never stops and the night never ends for those who choose to become part of the show.